You're listening to the inaugural Dr. John Telford Show. I'm John Telford, and my aim in doing this show is to have an opportunity to discuss issues that have impact on the Detroit Public Schools, on the city of Detroit, the state of Michigan, and indeed sometimes on the national scene. I am a retired deputy school superintendent who, for the past 5 years, worked and administrated and taught at Detroit Finney High School. And I have with me today, as my inaugural guest, my esteemed colleague, Robert Bennett. And Mr. Bennett is going to tell you a little bit about himself, and then we're going to launch right into some discussions about the situation in the schools.
Yeah, I'm still working for Detroit Public Schools, and I know Dr. Telford because he was my boss last year. He was a curriculum leader there at Finney High School, and I was one of the teachers in the social studies department. And we're just going to sit here and discuss for you and hopefully for your edification some of the problems and challenges that are facing Detroit Public Schools, looking at it from both the inside and the outside.
And given the concerns that both of us have about the schools, what's your take on the money problems that are underway in the schools right now?
The money problems seem to be chronic. They've been going on for ever since the state took over. We were accused of mismanagement before that, but at least there was some kind of stability in the system before the state takeover. But since the state takeover and the state was kind enough to run up hundreds of millions of dollars in deficit, and now they stepped out and they're demanding, now that they're not taking over, they're demanding a package or a system so that Detroit makes up the deficit. As a result, Detroit schools are really strapped cash-wise, which means things like books, teacher-student ratio, and lots of other things that have to do with whether good education is delivered are being impacted.
You know, I was a deputy superintendent of schools in the suburbs.
Right.
And many of the things that I have seen happen in Detroit, very frankly, a good case in point. Tim Gore, one of your colleagues,
Right.
And I were both teaching social studies classes last year. And we had one set of geography books and one set of global issues books to share with 4 classes. And this was in a situation where downtown was saying that there wasn't any problem with books. Had this been a circumstance that happened, say, in the Rochester Community Schools, where I was deputy superintendent for 8 years, they would have called out the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the National Guard, and the Marines. But in Detroit, it almost seems to be business as usual. What's your take on that?
Well, the supply situation is only one part of it. And of course, you're not teaching school without books. You got to have books in order to teach the lessons. And we have too much old books or shared books where you have one class set. That's going on for far too much. And right now, as I understand it, we can't buy anything right now because the vendors aren't servicing us. We're having a problem getting vendors to give us the books up front because they're afraid they won't get paid. So the situation is going from bad to worse.
After I retired, I came back to Detroit schools and taught and coached for the first time in a number of years. And that was in 1999. came back and taught and coached, and I found that the circumstances had changed markedly in terms of availability of supplies, availability of facilities. The swimming pool at Southwestern High School didn't work. The swimming pool at Finney High School, where you and I worked together, has not functioned for 8 years. And again, you know, I'm talking about the National Guard or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. That would happen immediately in Rochester or Plymouth Canton or some of the other school districts where I was an administrator. And yet they just seem to keep going on, and parents complain, kids complain. You remember when we had that student exchange with Grosse Pointe North High School? Grosse Pointe is an affluent suburb of Detroit, for those viewers who aren't that familiar with Grosse Pointe. And the kids from Finney were looking at that Olympic level swimming pool they had over there, and I could see the hurt in their eyes. What's your take on that?
Well, whenever we take our kids to visit other places, they have a similar experience, and they get the idea that they're not as appreciated or as valued as children in other places. And it is I can see why they would be hurt, and it's a hard thing for them to swallow. So that's one of the things that we have to sort of counter, is to teach not only our subject, but teach the students so they understand their value despite the shortcomings that they're getting in the system. And that's one of the most important things that we have to constantly work on, trying to get across to our students, that no matter what the circumstance is, you can overcome if you can realize your own self-worth and act accordingly.
You make a good point there, Bob, and you know, people would ask why this is happening. There are many reasons that are very obvious, and there are some that perhaps aren't as obvious as they might seem. The one most obvious reason is that the Detroit Public Schools get a little bit less than $8,000 a kid, compared to suburbs like Birmingham that are getting $13,000, $14,000 from the state. Another problem that I have seen when I came back to Detroit, in fact, when I came back to Detroit, I was only back in Detroit for a year when Ken Burnley came to town, the superintendent, and put me in charge of the southwest side, because I had been a deputy superintendent and he wanted to use my administrative skills. But almost immediately I found myself clashing with his assistant superintendent for instruction, the assistant CEO, because she was doing some things that were really counterproductive to the educational process, including putting in a testing program called ESAT, Essential Skills Attainment Test, that was taking the kids out of instruction and giving them more tests. They didn't need more tests. They needed fewer tests. Another thing she wanted to do was to raise the graduation requirements. In the suburbs we had 22 credits, and she wanted to bump it up to 30, which would have caused kids to drop out. So I talked to Ken Burnley about that, and Ken was a friend of mine and had brought me back because I had known him since he was 15 years old, and I had coached him briefly when he was a high school runner and also a college runner. And he did reverse his assistant superintendent for instruction on that issue, the testing issue. He also reversed her on the issue of wanting to add to the graduation requirements. But some of the other things that this lady was doing, incidentally, I got fired at the end of the year, and I went and ran the Team for Justice for a year, and then he fired her and brought me back at the end of the second year. And in addition, of course, to the unfairness and the imbalance between the suburban allotment and the Detroit allotment, and also the unfairness in terms of what they're doing to Finney kids and Denby kids and Central kids as compared to Cass Tech and Renaissance, which are the elite schools that are getting an inordinate amount of the dollars and the facilities. What are some of the other budget disparities that you see, Bob?
Well, I think that one of the biggest problems that Detroit sees right now is the loss of population. The number of students that are leaving Detroit and leaving the state altogether and leaving the charter schools, going to charter schools. So that, I think, is the next big thing. And I think what we're not seeing, I don't see anybody addressing, is the fact that the main reason people leave schools is the safety issue.
Oh, yes.
The thing that parents are most concerned about is the physical well-being of their child. They are desperately concerned about their education. But am I going to see my child in one piece at 3 o'clock? And is he going to be mentally put together? Will he be terrorized or picked on or be the subject of bullying, or will he have to be afraid to go from class to class? That is at least as important an issue. And unfortunately, the way the administration is run, it doesn't seem that the schools get the support from downtown that they need to get for discipline. And it doesn't seem that, in most cases, the teachers get the support they need from the administration in the school. And I think it all comes from downtown. The attitude that downtown has toward the school is then reflected by the attitude the administration has toward its teachers. And in trying to save a few people who do not conform, sends away many more people who are trying to conform. One of my colleagues had the problem of a girl who was attacked. Of course, she was the smartest girl in class. And of course, her parents came, and the girl who attacked her stayed there because they didn't want to get rid of her. They had a couple of days suspension, and she was back doing the same thing. So the girl, good girl, her parents took her and took her elsewhere. And then the girl started on the next guy, the smartest girl in class. That girl stayed in class while 2 or 3 of the good students wound up leaving. I've seen people come in to register this child and watch and see that there's too much chaos in the hall and take the child, get up and leave and go elsewhere. And those are the kind of things that are really, really hurting Detroit public schools. They have to get a hold on discipline. They have to create the correct educational atmosphere.
The last year I was at Finney with you. I taught 3 classes, and too frequently I was coming out of the class to help a teacher who was having a discipline problem. But I always did it. But I felt that I was shortchanging my kids when I did it. At least you can stay in the class, the whole time. Of course, a couple times you come and bail a few teachers out too. Okay, we talked about the dropouts.
Right.
We're down to 30,000. We lost 30,000 kids this year. Incredible number.
Wow, was that high?
Well, they've gone from 101,000 last year to 77,000. What's that? 87, 97, 07. Yeah, it's almost 30,000 kids.
Woo.
That's I think it's probably some kind of a national record. So I'm going to ask you to comment. You talked about why they're dropping out, but you haven't, and I don't know if you've. I feel comfortable criticizing the administration. I don't know how comfortable you feel about it, but I mean, we got a new superintendent who's absolutely clueless. She hasn't done anything in a year. You've got this thing timed, so you know how much time we've got left?
Yeah.
Okay. You want to talk about that?
I'm perfectly comfortable, yes.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly comfortable criticizing anybody.
Okay, I'll segue into that then and let him talk.
Go right ahead.
Give me the cue. Bob, and you talked about the dropouts and some of the reasons. The kids are afraid of the violence. And that not only is the dropout problem, an incredibly damaging problem to the schools and to the city, but this year with a new administration and a new superintendent who isn't new anymore, because Dr. Connie Calloway has been in the district now for a little bit over a year. During that length of time, and over this past summer, the Detroit Public Schools have lost almost 30,000 students. Now those kids aren't just in the charter schools in the suburbs or the streets. They are at home. You know, they're not going to school at all. And that figure, almost 30,000, is I think it's some kind of a national record. What's your take on that?
Absolutely. We feel it and we can see it. When I signed up and went to Finney, there must have been at least 1,500 students there.
Yeah.
And now I had to leave because we're down to 650. And I only have like 15 years in, and I'm like low man on the totem pole because all the new teachers are going. And we're getting down to the point where the veterans are being redeployed because there are so few students left. So that's why I'm at Holly Magnet Middle School now, which is a bit different.
Oh, yeah.
But it is better in a lot of ways than it's one of the more elite schools in some ways and less elite in others. The building is very, very old, and we should be in a new building, in a much newer building than the building the facility that we're left with. I mean, they don't even have a men's room for the men teachers, which is pretty rough conditions for us to be working in. But there are some dedicated people there, and we are trying to do the best to get the scores back up. Hallie has been in the habit of doing better than the state average, and they slid a little under that lately, and they're trying to get back there.
Well, Hallie is very fortunate to have you. You know, Hallie's gain is Finney's loss. One of the problems that high schools are facing, and high school principals in particular, is that they get stuck, if stuck is the word, with kids that are coming out of the middle school who went into the middle school reading at the 3rd and 4th grade level, and they're coming out of the middle school reading at the 3rd and 4th grade level, and then we get them. And with the No Child Left Behind and Bush's unfunded program, the people that are getting blamed if they don't bring those kids up to 11th, 12th grade reading level in 4 years are the principals, and they get bounced. What's your take on that?
My take is we need maybe a remedial hire and a more realistic plan that takes people where they are. For instance, there's no remedial math in high school. We start with algebra and we insist they take algebra when some of them really aren't up to algebra. And you can't go to the next level, especially in math, without having had the previous level. And we need an opportunity to take some of the students who are not advanced enough to get into algebra, take them and give them what they need, which may be further back. And going further back, even if we do promote, we have to recognize the shortcomings of some of our 4th graders or 5th graders and make sure that when it's only a year or 6 months behind, we can work with it. But by the time you get 4 and 6 years behind, you're talking about getting to high school, which is the 9th grade, and still reading at 4th and 5th grade level. It becomes more than a challenge for the school and more than a challenge for the student.
Let me run an idea by you. What do you think of the idea? And you and I have been in Finney. We were together for 5 years, and we've seen a lot of misbehaviors and kids acting out. What about and we know that a lot of these kids are doing it because they can't read. What about taking these kids without spending any more money on them, just kind of squeezing the balloon of the budget, but putting more money into these kids in some alternative settings, and maybe having the other classes get a little larger, so that we can give these kids some help. Social workers, maybe truant officers, a lot of things.
When I call for remedial high and maybe remedial middle school, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Someplace where you're concentrating social workers and counselors, etc., to help them with some of the problems they have that may be keeping them from achieving where they're achieving. Because right now they're spread out, and the problem is spread out, and we're not covering everybody. If we put them together, then we could concentrate resources, the resources there that they need.
Right. Beautiful.
We wouldn't need as much security at the other schools.
Amen.
If the problem children were put together.
Right.
We wouldn't need as many social workers if the problem and where the children with the problems are, that's where the resources that they need should be.
Beautiful.
Rather than spreading them all over the city and they don't get to any of the people they need to be getting to. So they need more structure, and we could give them more structure.
Several years ago, I wrote a newspaper column in which I think I was the first one to launch the suggestion, and I'm going to run this one by you too, of dividing the Detroit Public Schools into 4 separate entities. I know that this could add to administration because you'd have to have 4 separate superintendents. But these 4 districts, this idea of mine would have the 4 districts competing against each other for kids. And it makes me wonder if perhaps a little competition in that regard might not be such a bad idea. What's your take on that?
Well, the district is already divided into, we already divide by, once we call them districts, and I think there are several other different areas, Area A, Area B, through Area E. And so, in a way, it's already been separated. But they're not independent. Right. They fall under an even bigger umbrella. And I'm not sure that the bigger umbrella is helping. Maybe what we call the Detroit Public Schools could function more like what do we call it in the suburbs? School district?
School of choice?
No. Well, besides the
magnet school?
No. Not a particular school, but over and above the schools, we would have a sort of independent school district that several different districts are under.
Okay.
And they each run their own show, but they share certain resources together that is under the umbrella of the
transportation, maybe.
Transportation and maybe some other things
food services, maybe
that could be provided by the district, and education, etc., could be handled on a more local basis. Because one of the problems I find with the Detroit schools is that we have generals who've never visited the battlefield making decisions, and therefore they don't know what the effect the decisions they're making have on the students and teachers and administrators at the school.
There is such a disconnect. You're right, Bob, about that. I mean, there is almost a total disconnect between the central administration and the folks like you and I was, out there toiling in the trenches. There has to be an administration that gets out in the buildings. I did that when I was a deputy superintendent. I was there every day. I was in one building or another. What we really need, in addition to new leadership in the Detroit Public Schools, is about 8,000 Bob Bennett's, because this man was one of the most intrepid teachers. I mean, anytime I called on him for help, he was there. That's what we need in the Detroit Public Schools. And how to get more teachers, who have that kind of qualification and have that kind of personal characteristic, I'm not sure. But that's what we need in Detroit, and we need it desperately. My guest has been Bob Bennett on the Dr. John Telford Show. Tune in next time. Thank you for listening.